Okay, so our recording has started. So welcome everyone, and thank you very, very much for attending this workshop on decolonizing magic. For those of you who are not familiar with kind of the general social movement of decolonization, the idea is taking time to reflect on things we've always done and the way we've always thought about things, to examine systemic bias that most of us just don't think about. There is a huge legacy of systemic white supremacy that is in pretty much every part of mainstream society, and the magical, pagan, and occult communities are not immune to this, not even a little tiny bit. Um, so we are going to talk about some of the things that we can do as individuals to help decolonize the way we think about magic, about paganism, about occultism, about nature-based spiritualities in general. And there's a lot to cover. So I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the first peoples of the Puget Sound region, the Coast Salish people, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the traditional stewards of the land. That's step one for decolonization, is recognizing that almost all of us have gotten here as the result of colonization of someone else's land. And so we acknowledge that there are people that came before us and their land was stolen from them. It's not great. And acknowledging that it happened is literally the least we can do. So some basic rules of conduct for this particular workshop. I am operating under the assumption of good faith. I am assuming that everyone attending this workshop is here in order to learn, to do some self-reflection, to open their eyes. That means this is not the appropriate time for debating whether this is a good idea. It also means this is not an appropriate time for playing the devil's advocate. Leave that for Reddit, far away from me. The other thing to be really careful about is, as we're going through some of this material, you might want to talk about experiences that you've had in your own life. And that's awesome. And that can be saved for the question and answer period at the end, if it is relevant. But be very careful not to engage in misery poker or the oppression Olympics. Bad things happen to all people from all walks of life. It's not about who's had it worse. And also, this is not a comfortable topic. If you are 100% comfortable with everything I say, either you're some kind of strange bodhisattva or you're lying to yourself. This is supposed to be uncomfortable because we're supposed to be changing, and change is hard. Word on scope. Today, we're only going to talk about the main effects of systemic racism in our practice. We're not going to talk about general community structures and power imbalances. We're not going to talk about gender or sexuality or any of that, because it's such a big topic on its own. It deserves its own workshop led by someone who is an expert in that type of thing. Just a quick note about me. I am a practicing witch. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I am a Latina. So I have a very tiny amount of personal experience in this stuff. But as a white passing person of color, my exposure to the worst of the worst is very, very minimal. And I am happy to yield the floor to other people's experiences when it is appropriate to do so. So, first off, we have to be very, very mindful in this topic that every single one of us has engaged in some type of colonial practice while in the magical and pagan and occult communities. because it's everywhere and we don't think about it. And most of us have learned from sources that are steeped in these older systems and older ideas. Um, and that's okay. This is not about beating yourself up. This is about examining what you're doing and being open to change. Change is a process, not an event. Simply attending this workshop and paying attention is great. But until you actually begin engaging in self reflection and changing behaviors, you're not really doing anything yet. This is not a one and done. Every day I learn some new thing to feel bad about, to be honest. Um, it's not about beating yourself up. It's not about trying to be perfect. It's not about making huge sweeping changes in your life and practice. It's about taking small steps mindfully to try and make a better practice for yourself and a better community for all of us. The other thing that is super important, it's really easy to get defensive about practices you've been engaging in for a while. I might insult something you hold very, very dear. And that's not to say that that thing that you hold dear is bad, but it might be rooted in something that is bad. If you are part of mainstream culture, you don't get to decide if you are being appropriative or fetishizing or demonizing or engaging in exoticism. The people who are being oppressed get to decide if your behavior is okay or not. The last year has taught us a lot about what we think we're doing versus what we're actually doing. And just be mindful that you might have done something that hurts someone. You probably didn't do it on purpose. That's okay. The trick is if you've done something to stop doing it, that's the first step. Then if it's appropriate, if you have someone to apologize to, you apologize. And then you change your behavior. You don't do that again. That's the really key part. Stop engaging in a harmful behavior and then do something else that is less harmful or not harmful at all. The decolonization process is very much about harm reduction. It is not a perfect practice. Like I said, we learn new things every day. Critical race theory has taught us that the way we even think about this, as much as we try, we still have new things to learn. So being open-minded is absolutely critical to really engaging in this process in a productive way that is good for everybody. So, our history. If you know much about the history of Western mainstream magical pagan cultures, most of them were invented by rich white people. Rich white people starting in about 1880s for the kind of mainstream forms that we have today. And then there were some movements that happened in like the 30s and 40s. And then, of course, in the United States, when we had the 1960s, that started a whole new set of movements. And as the people got slightly less affluent and slightly more middle class, they stayed really, really white. Mainstream paganism and occultism is super duper white. When you go into big public spaces, you look around, there's not a lot of people of color. It's a real problem we have. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to talk about some of them. But for the most part, we have some issues with being really, really white. Most of our kind of founders and luminaries, if we look back to Helena Blavatsky, Gerald Gardner, Starhawk, folks that are still around. These people have wonderful intentions. Most of these people have amazing, wonderful intentions of reconnecting with the earth and engaging in a more authentic set of spiritual and magical practices. But these people are products of their time. They're products of their own environments. We have, look at people like Aleister Crowley. Great contributions to the legacy of Western magic. Super problematic human. Not the nicest of people. Did some really bad things. And so we need to learn to both respect some of the people that created the systems and thought processes that we use now, but to recognize that they are human and flawed, and some of the things that they enacted need to change. It's very easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater with a lot of this stuff. It is possible to actually find a balance between acknowledging a practice as problematic while preserving the best parts of it. And we'll talk a little bit about that some later on. The other thing, going back to we're not here to flog ourselves and feel guilty about everything. We are not responsible for the systemic racism that is built into these structures that we have inherited and these thought processes and practices that we've inherited. What we are accountable for is what we do with them. That's why we're engaging in this work, to look at our practices, see where we need to be doing better, and to make positive change. So there's 3 main areas that we need to think about in terms of decolonization: exoticism, cultural appropriation, and the demonization of indigenous practices. And we're going to talk about each of these 3 areas in some pretty deep detail. If at any point you have questions as I'm going through it, feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to answer them as is most appropriate. So the first one is exoticism. I am personally very guilty of engaging in exoticism, and it's something that I have to be mindful of and work on every day. If you're not familiar with the term, exoticism is the tendency to adopt the exotic, things that are strange or foreign or mysterious, and to hold them as better and of higher value than things that are familiar to us. It's a little bit of the grass is always greener kind of thing. It's the herbs that grow wild at the bus stop can't possibly be as magical as these things that I've ordered from an organic, wild crafter in Sussex. Why not? Why is the plantain growing on the bus stop not as magical or special as the, Dittany of Crete that you've ordered from Sicily? Honestly, I think the things that are growing in our sidewalks are more magically potent because we can just pick them, use them. They're still alive. They still have chi, magic, whatever. As opposed to something that's been shipped 10,000 miles, has been sitting in a cupboard for who knows how long. And the same applies to magical practices. There's a huge issue with adopting practices from the Far East and the Near East. It's some ancient practice from India. It must be super special and awesome, as opposed to this magical practice that this guy down the street says he made up, but is super awesome and works really well for him. Why is the thing from a culture you've never even engaged in more special than the thing developed in the world you actually live in? That's exoticism. Just because something is strange and you don't understand it and it's new to you doesn't make it better than something that is familiar to you. And honestly, why make your life more difficult than it needs to be? use what you have. Um, Not to say that you can't use things from other cultures and things that are exotic and foreign and mysterious. You certainly can, but they're not necessarily any better. Part of exoticism is also fetishization. This is a real problem in vast swaths of magical and occult communities. Is so the definition of fetishization is to have an excessive and irrational commitment to or obsession with something. Let's go back to some of those ancient practices from India or Tibet. Literally any magic from Tibet. How many Western occultists are like, oh, it's from Tibet, so it must be the super special magical stuff. Really? Think about things like voodoo or Romani magical practices. These things are both fetishized and demonized at the same time, sometimes by the same people. It's a whole Madonna whore thing. Practices are strange and mysterious and they feel more authentic, so they must be super special because I'm not familiar with them. Not knowing something doesn't make it better than what you know. There's a huge amount of things, particularly here in the United States, where if it's a Native American practice, it must be better because it's true to the spirit of the land, and no immigrant who has come here and lived here could possibly have the connection to the land that someone who is a Native American descent and lives in a skyscraper and has never done any of their traditional practices. Are we seeing the disconnect here? Just because something seems special doesn't actually mean that it is. And something that seems completely mundane might be the greatest source of magic you could possibly touch. There's things like the magical Negro. One of the worst tropes in storytelling in the United States is this bizarre idea that, you've got your group of white protagonists going through the wilderness and they come upon the cabin and there's the old Negro man or the old Native American man who imparts wisdom upon them, and then suddenly they have the tools to win the day. Because of course they needed someone to hand them that without them doing the work for it so that they can then be the heroes. It's fetishization at its worst. It both makes something special and removes value from it without a white savior. It's very bad. Part and parcel with fetishization is universalizing. This is a personal pet peeve of mine as a Latina. I'm not Mexican. I'm Puerto Rican Panamanian. Completely different. Do you know how many countries are in Latin America? Do you know how many classes, races are in Latin America? There's something like 23 countries. There's not only are there like 5 major kind of European languages spoken, there's thousands of indigenous dialects, so many cultures. We are not all the same. Native American tribes are not all the same. The teepee is not a symbol of Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. There were no teepees here because we don't have vast prairies. We have longhouses and salmon and cedar bark things. I personally know not that much beyond Washington State History's version of Latin American history, Native American history here. So I apologize for any inaccuracies. But universalizing is bad. We have these huge cultures. Look at Africa. Do you have any idea how big Africa is? It's enormous. There are so many different cultures there. Expecting someone from Egypt to have the same ethos as someone from Rwanda is ridiculous. How much do people in Maine have in common with people from Mississippi? People are different all over the place. But particularly things like Native Americans and, hoodoo practitioners. They get all lumped as one big group. Sorry, man. They're not one big group. Look at in Seattle how many different pagan groups they are and how many different denominations. And we're all super similar when it comes to where we are and kind of what we do. We can't agree in groups of more than like 10 people. Why would we expect everyone else to all just be a big block? It's the internalization of prejudice, unfortunately. And if we don't deliberately seek out more information about what people are actually like and what different cultures are actually out there, it's really easy to stumble into stereotyping and prejudice. And gosh, we all do it. Look at something like the Dreamcatcher. When I was a kid, you could buy, make your own Dreamcatcher kits at Target. And it's within the last 2 years that I learned that that's actually a very specific practice of the Ojibwe tribe that has been utterly appropriated by mainstream culture and is used extensively in magical circles. And we don't think about where it's actually come from. We don't have the cultural context. I certainly don't know the actual cultural context for how to use a dream catcher. Things like smudging. Anybody can do a smoke cleansing. Smudging is a specific Native American spiritual practice. We'll talk more about cultural appropriation in a few minutes. The other thing that is super important in terms of stereotyping and exoticism, this is something that I have seen in pagan community multiple times. There is an expectation that if someone is a POC, they must do some kind of POC tradition. Why assume that? A black man can worship Odin just as much as a white man can work with Chango. There's no hard and fast rule that if someone is of African descent, they must work with the Ifa or Voodoo or Palo or something like that. Just because I'm Latin American doesn't mean that I do Santeria, and I don't. There is this huge assumption that if someone is a POC in pagan space, they must do some kind of POC tradition. Why? I know plenty of POCs that are just straight up European style witches, and there's nothing wrong with that. And assuming otherwise can be really hurtful. So yeah, try not to make assumptions about that sort of thing. Any questions about exoticism, fetishization, universalism, any of that? I'll give you see if anybody's typing, give that a minute before I move into cultural appropriation, which is probably the biggest bugbear in pagan community. Because we love strange and mysterious practices that we don't understand. We love them. And some of them are awesome, but we don't necessarily have the right to them or understand them well enough to execute them without appropriating them. It takes a lot of deliberate work, which is hard. No questions so far, so I'll get digging right into cultural appropriation. So, yeah. So cultural appropriation is commonly defined as the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, and ideas of one people or society by members of another, typically more dominant people or society. Think of wearing Native American headdresses at Coachella. That's a perfect example of what to never do. Also, wearing bindi at clubs because they're sparkly, having no idea what they mean. It's not a good idea. It's really not a good idea. One of the things that is the most contentious about cultural appropriation is who gets to say what is or isn't appropriative. And the answer is the people who the custom's been stolen from get to say. You know, if you are engaging in a practice that is from a culture that is foreign to yours, particularly if it's something that has been traditionally oppressed by mainstream culture, and they ask you not to do something that you have adopted from their culture, you should stop. Always listen when someone from an oppressed culture has something to say about their own culture and practices. They're the ones with the authority to make that kind of call. That's not to say you can't appreciate another culture. You absolutely can. A lot of my personal practices come out of the Mexican style of curanderismo. I am not Mexican, not a single drop of Mexican blood. I appreciate their culture, and I investigate deeply the cultural context, and I learn and get permission from people who are part of those cultures. There is a very thin line sometimes between appreciating a culture and appropriating a culture. Appropriation disproportionately benefits the dominant culture while giving little to nothing back and sometimes doing harm to the culture being appropriated. Think about the American celebration of Cinco de Mayo. Let's just say there is nothing that pisses off my Chicano friends more than white frat boys' version of Cinco de Mayo. It's not Mexican Independence Day. It's not Cinco de Drinko. Wearing a funny mustache and a sombrero, that's not cool. It actively harms the culture it comes from. You know, those people are actively, dumped on by huge portions of mainstream society. You know, racist against immigrants, against migrant workers. It's very bad. It's very, very bad. Don't do it. And it's an issue of power imbalance at its heart. Mainstream culture is a juggernaut. And the ability to steamroll or erase the meaning behind a cultural practice from some minority culture or oppressed culture, it happens so quickly and so thoroughly. I mean, it's shocking how easy it is to destroy subcultures. Something like, the smudging practice that I'm willing to bet every single person here has done smudging at some point, or at least what they thought was smudging, which is, a specific practice. But most of us have burned white sage or sweetgrass or cedar as a form of smoke cleansing. I do, but I don't call it smudging. Because there is a whole tradition, a set of lore, cultural practices, and training behind traditional Native American smudging. Like, I practice curanderismo, and we actually call it smudging. We use, a sahumerio, which is the Spanish word for it, but it's the same practice, and it's done by the indigenous Central and South Americans the same way it's done by the indigenous North Americans. But because this is so popular, and you can now get like your Sephora witch kit with like a crystal and a little sage bundle, very cringy. The actual native peoples who burn white sage as part of their sacred medicine are having a hard time sourcing their own traditional ingredients because it's being over-farmed, and the The plants are these high desert, slow growing plants that are being utterly decimated in the wild because we think it's cool. And we should be able to do that, right? That's actively doing harm to the people from whom we've adopted this practice. It's why personally, when I do spiritual, fumigation or smoke cleanses, I will get the cedar from my yard and I'll dry it, hanging it up, and then I'll burn that. It grows in my yard. It's my tree. What more powerful magic could I get than the thing that I nurture and using it, as opposed to buying something that does not grow up here, that has no relation to my personal existence, and is actively harming somebody else. It's a problem. So, yeah. But that goes back to the idea of that razor's thin edge between appreciation and appropriation. One of the things that I like to use in as an example, your great Aunt Marge's special birthday banana bread. It's a secret recipe. If we are making banana bread, anybody can make banana bread. There's a zillion versions of banana bread. But if I make banana bread out of the Betty Crocker cookbook, I'm not going to say that it's Aunt Marge's super secret recipe, because it's not. That's why anybody can smolder an herb and do a smoke cleansing. But that is different than a Native American smudging ceremony. We can appreciate cultural practices, but if we don't have the full context to say that we're actually engaging in them, we can use some of the magical technology, the technical practice, and we can say that it is inspired by a cultural practice, but it's not part of that practice. The most recent ritual that I presented, where we did the flower blessing, was inspired by curanderismo and certain Latin American traditions, but it was a version of it. And so it was not one of those things. If you find some amazing cultural practice as part of a closed practice, maybe you don't have access to more information, maybe you don't have permission, you are allowed to take the kind of the technology underlying the practice and use it, but you don't get to pretend that you're doing this super special cultural practice. It's a very, very fine line. And it's, like I said, it's one of those things where there's risk involved. Anytime you're using another culture's practice or something that is based on another culture's practice, you might have someone from that culture say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. And if that happens, apologize, stop doing it, find something else. There are so many different magical practices out there. There's 1,000 ways to get from point A to point B. If one road is closed, choose a different one. There are so many options and so many less problematic things you could choose to do. Try them out, see how it works for you. One of the trickiest aspects, particularly with cultural appropriation, is personal gnosis. In paganism, a lot of occultism, witchcraft, druidry, we as individuals can have conversations with spirits, with deities, with ancestors, with fae. And those spirits we speak to might tell us that we're allowed to do certain things. Things that if we did them in public might be considered appropriative. Nobody gets to tell you that what you know in your heart to be true is not. If you're concerned that your personal gnosis has told you that you're allowed to do something, that you should do something, that you must do something that might be considered appropriative, I suggest you do it in private and not tell anybody. The thing that separates appreciation from appropriation is what it does to the culture you're taking the practice from. What you do in the privacy of your own home and you don't tell other people about doesn't hurt them. I will never forget, I was at a workshop at PantheaCon a few years ago on Santa Muerte. And part of Santa Muerte's traditional practice, the actual like Mexican practice, is that Santa Muerte stands alone. She is always has her own space, her own shelf, her own altar, whatever it is. She stands alone. She does not share space. And as the presenter was explaining, that part of the cultural practice of being a muertista is having a special place for her. One of the audience members is like, well, I spoke to her and La Santísima said I could put her on the same shelf with Freya. She was very Hot Topic goth, which is fine. I was one many years ago. And I'm not saying that her personal conversation with La Santísima didn't happen. Maybe it did. Maybe it's totally okay. But by telling the Mexican traditional practitioner that he was wrong because of her personal gnosis, that's where she crossed the line. What she does at home, who cares? The Santísima says you can't do that, and she does it. La Santísima will take care of the problem. It became appropriation when she told the authentic cultural practitioner that he was wrong. So if you have your personal gnosis, your headcanon, as they might say in fan culture, that's cool. Have it. Keep it to yourself. So, yeah. One of the most common problems with appropriative practices or potentially appropriative practices, people get very, very precious about their practices. All of us are a little bit insecure because most of us have come into these practices, on our own. And so there's a certain seeking of validation. And we think that the more authentic the practices are, the better. And so if you have a practice that you love and someone tells you that it's appropriative, there's this tendency to be kind of like passive aggressively overcorrecting and be like, I'm just going to take my ball and go home. I'll never do anything like that again. It's like, chill. Just because someone says you shouldn't call that smudging because you don't know the Native American ceremony that is capital S smudging, doesn't mean you can't still smolder herbs to cleanse your space. Just maybe choose ones like, I use rosemary all the time. I literally use kitchen spices. I use things that I pick off of trees. That's fine, but I don't call it smudging. It's just smoke cleansing. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater because something freaks you out or somebody offends you by calling you out on something you're maybe doing wrong. We have to be mature about these things. There are so many options, like I was just saying, there's so many ways of doing things. If one very specific practice is something that maybe is appropriative, maybe check out literally anything else. There are shelves upon shelves of books. There are so many traditions. There are so many different practitioners with different ways of doing things. Just remove the appropriative bit and then keep going. You don't have to like leave the community in a huff because somebody calls you out on something. You grow and change because you're a living, thinking being that grows and changes. So, yeah. One of the kind of unintended side effects of people's knee-jerk reactions to being called out for appropriation is it makes safe It makes our community unsafe for POCs. I know a lot of POCs that have left pagan and occult communities because they tried to call someone out and just got backlashed. Oh, this isn't appropriate. Or how can you say that? Or I've been doing this for years. Or, any number of the, I'm going to take my ball and go home kind of reactions. That is going to drive POCs away faster than almost anything. Like, it's almost worse for someone to claim to be an ally, but do these kind of microaggressive things than for the folks that are just like outright racist. We know to just avoid them. It's fine. But when someone you think is an ally says something terrible to you, that cuts deep. That cuts real deep. If we want our communities to be truly safe space, we need to walk our talk better than we have. So yeah, there is a happy middle. There is a happy middle between being afraid of crossing the line and actually crossing the line. It takes openness, transparency, a willingness to change, and a certain amount of not taking it personally. Just because some practice that you learned from a book written in the 80s turns out to be appropriative doesn't mean you are bad. It doesn't mean that you are evil. It just means that you learned something from someone who wasn't as informed as you are now. It's an opportunity to grow, to find better ways of doing things. And that is really the key to maneuvering the space we find ourselves in. We have to be open to change. And we have to listen, really listen, and learn how to not take it personally. You can be a valid practitioner and make mistakes. If you haven't made mistakes, are you even doing anything? I mean, this is how we learn. We make mistakes, we change, we do better. That brings us to demonization. There is a really unfortunate tendency, particularly of some of the New Age writers, where there's black magic and low magic and those scary non-white light practices like voodoo with sacrifices. Very pearl clutching. Voodoo is a great example. I know a lot of practitioners that are scared witless of voodoo and Santeria and Palo Mayombe and other kind of diaspora traditions because they do the deep, dark, scary things. Well, yes. That doesn't make them evil. Any more than doing, things that are morally gray makes someone a bad person. It's not how that works. A lot of this comes from media, horror movies and books and things like that. I love Stephen King, adore Stephen King. The book and movie Thinner has an evil gypsy. Super racist. Very upsetting. But the evil, spooky, exotic practitioner has the real magic. Hell, we even have like Disney, The Princess and the Frog has the evil Bokor witch doctor, does the indigenous practices, therefore must be evil. Sure. A lot of these things are based in fear and greed and envy. In the American South during the slave era, the slaves were forbidden from practicing traditional African religion because the slave owners were afraid that would give them some form of power and thus threaten the slave owners. And we have kept that legacy all the way until today, where these indigenous practices from Africa are seen as scary and evil because some rich white men felt threatened a couple hundred years ago. It's not a good thing. Not a good thing at all. The tendency to demonize things like sacrifice. In Haitian voodoo, it is very common for on special holy celebrations and things like St. John's Night, where you would sacrifice a goat. This goat is treated well, and every single part of that goat is used. It's an impoverished tradition where the only thing they have to give, and the most important thing they have to give, is literally the food right out of their mouths. As that means chickens, goats, other livestock. Just because we are in a place where we do not consider it a sacrifice to give up our food, for those of us that are stable enough to not have food insecurity, doesn't mean we get to demonize practices that developed out of food insecurity. In context of the cultures where these things arise, it's not barbaric, it's not evil. It's a powerful sacrifice, being willing to give up your own sustenance for your devotions. And yet, mainstream pagan cult, our communities tend to have this view of this suburban grocery store. For me to go out and find an animal and kill it is pretty barbaric, because I don't need to do that. For me, a sacrifice that would be much more appropriate would be something like giving to charity, or, making something and then giving it up, as opposed to, an agrarian, food insecure society where, it's the equivalent of essentially giving up your rent for a devotion. But in this context of colonialism, it's evil. And we've got to think about these things differently. Now, that's not to say that all practices are okay. They're not. There's a line to be drawn about what's okay to do and what isn't. Obviously, if you're not comfortable with a practice, don't participate in it. But don't call out someone else's practice as evil if it actually isn't. If this knee-jerk reaction that it's dark, it's bad, it's evil, is rooted because it's different, because we don't know why, because we don't understand, because it's from something foreign and strange to us, that's not okay. So what do we do moving forward? Each individual, we need to take the time to assess our own practices. What are we doing that is appropriative, that is demonizing, that is based in exoticism? Look at your own practices. Look at your own mores. Think about where they come from. How did they develop? Did you read it in a book once? Or do you have a deep-seated personal feeling about it? Think about it. If you find that you're doing something that maybe is not the greatest in terms of being colonized, try something else. Do the research, do your homework, find out what your options are, and try something else. There are more Facebook groups, Reddit channels, websites, subgroups, that I can shake a stick at. If you're trying to do something and are not sure how to do it without engaging in colonialism, ask. It's not that hard. There are so many options. If you ask how to do something, you will get different answers from every person that responds. And man, we like to talk about what we do. So finding people to help is not not even remotely difficult. Yeah. Something to really think about in your own personal practices is, are you chasing validation and authenticity? Are you trying to use some other cultural or historic practice because it seems more real than something, more homegrown? I do pop culture magic. I literally will call upon Tony Stark to help me with my work because I work with computers. It's not some grand 1,000-year-old practice. I literally work with pop culture figures and characters. And it is more meaningful to me than working with some agrarian deity from the other side of the planet. Doesn't seem super spooky, but it's powerful and meaningful to me. Who's to say that's less valid than, trying to shoehorn some ancient deity into helping me with computer programming? Yeah. I want to talk real quickly about allyship. The last year has been really illuminating on who people really are, because we've seen people under extreme pressure. We've seen what they do with it. Some have done better than others. So if you would like to consider yourself an ally to POCs in this way, there's a lot of things that you can do and some things you should avoid. First is take a moment and mindfully examine the behavior of your peers. In the groups that you participate in the chats you engage in the people you talk to, that you practice with, are any of them engaging in any of these practices? Use your privilege and open a dialogue. Chances are real good other folks that are engaging in appropriative or colonial practices have no idea. Most people are operating in good faith. Most people are trying to do well, and some of them just don't know. So gently open a dialogue. Help them to be more informed. Make sure that your community is actually safe space to talk about these kinds of things. I've been to a lot of community spaces that purport to be safe space for this kind of discussion and yet are not. People need to model these behaviors of actually listening, of actually trying to change appropriative behaviors, of actually engaging in these dialogues, and then following through with them. You can't just say you're going to do better. You have to actually do better. And when you set up boundaries and set up safe spaces and then do not enforce the rules that make that safe space, you will see POCs run for the hills. Because we know that it's just a matter of time before somebody says something stupid, and then we will get in trouble for calling them out. It's happened multiple times. Don't like it. Possibly the most important thing to remember, if you want to call yourself an ally, it's not about you. It's not about getting praised or thanked or receiving a benediction for past sins. If you want to call yourself an ally, it is about lifting POC voices, about changing negative behaviors. It's about bettering your community actively. It's a continual process, always trying to do better and trying to make space better. It's not about you. You don't actually get to call yourself an ally. Only the oppressed communities can call you an ally. You can say you're trying to be an ally and that you're working on yourself, but you're not an ally until they tell you that you're an ally. So a lot of people have good intentions and fall short. And that is absolutely better than not trying at all. 100%. Kudos for taking the effort to even try, because a lot of people aren't. But it's not about you. It's about stopping ongoing harm. So don't expect to be put on a pedestal for doing the bare minimum to do better. There's a lot of performative allyship out there, and it is awful. You know, as I was saying earlier, all out racism is generally better than microaggressions because you can just avoid the terrible racists. It's the insidious little stuff that is really harmful. And when you're trying to do better and you're not doing better and you're not open to realizing that you're not actually doing better, that's awful. So if you're making a good faith effort, you need to also be open to correction. Sorry. Along those lines, allyship is about lifting POC voices and making space for POC voices where it has been stomped in the past. I am Latina, but I am about as white as a Latina can be. That's colorism. If someone who is, you know, more affected by these issues than me wants to speak up, I will step aside and let them. And I will get to the question in just a moment. And along those lines, particularly after this last year, your POC friends are tired. They are real tired of being the voice of how to deal with systemic racism because they happen to have melanin. Your POC friends are tired. Read a book. Show that you've made the effort on your own as far as you can before you start asking them questions. And yeah, make sure that if they don't want to talk to you about it, they don't have to. People are tired. It's been a really rough last couple of years. So one of the questions I've gotten is, what are good ways to find out about ongoing harm, especially if one's not already involved in groups talking about it? Ooh, it's a great question. And it's really difficult. You know, if you're in a group and you want to start examining these issues, the first thing to do is to start talking about it. Start talking about the different practices you have and where they've come from. You know, my practices over the years have developed from bits and pieces from a lot of different sources. But for most of the things that I do regularly, I can probably point out when I started doing those practices, what books I was reading, what people I was talking to. And I can say, oh, this practice comes from this practice comes from this over here, that one comes from over there. Look at where they come from. Are they based in Western European traditions? Are they based in Eastern traditions? Are they based in Native traditions? And then look at what they're doing. Think about what things are judged in your community, what things are considered wrong. Why are they considered wrong? Is it because they're actively hurting somebody, or is it because it's the rule that you've always had? Former is fine. The latter might need some deeper research and reflection. It's really hard. It's really hard to know if what you don't know. the Dreamcatcher thing is a good example where I had no idea that it was a very specific tribal practice that has been basically destroyed. All meaning has been removed from, thanks to mainstream culture. I literally learned about it like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. How was I supposed to find that information on my own? I don't know. The most important thing is to begin to engage in dialogue. And if something gets called out, to really examine it. And is that what you need to be doing? Are there better options? Are there things you can do to bring something that has been appropriated back into cultural context? Maybe you've got a group and a new member comes in who is from a particular culture that can inform you about these things and say, oh, you're doing X, Y, and Z. If you add these elements and these acknowledgments, then it's okay. Then it's the actual practice. But the way you're doing it now, you're missing some really critical things. Don't always have that luxury, unfortunately. And, as I said, POCs are real tired right now. And so not everyone's going to be open to answering questions. Your best option is just operate in transparency and good faith, do your best. And, you're going to make mistakes. And as long as you're open to changing, that's kind of all you can do. Because, hundreds upon hundreds of years of colonization is baked into the very fabric and foundation of every part of our society. All of it. Everything we do is based on atrocity. All we can do is pledge to do better and to make baby steps, acknowledge when you slip up, and keep trying to do better. So that is pretty much what I've got for this. Any other questions? 2 resources that I highly, highly recommend reading if you are interested in this work in particular. The first is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, who is actually a local Seattle author, so yay. And then How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And I highly recommend that you acquire these books from your local independent bookstore or someplace like bookshop.org, where it is putting money back into your local community. Other than that, also take the time to learn your history. Read Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton, has a great history of the kind of modern pagan magical movement. It's a little not glorifying, but it's definitely favorable towards some of our folks from the past. We need to make sure that we read these things critically, but learn your history. That is the number one way where you can identify problematic behaviors, is learn your history. I can put those book titles into chat. So yeah, any other questions, comments? I will turn off the recording in just a moment, so if people want to come on video and things, they'll be able to do so without being recorded. But any other kind of questions before I finish the recording? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording then.